Coming up, we investigate some of the most mysterious disappearances to ever take place in the Appalachian Mountains. Where did they go, and will they ever be found? This is Appalachia Unsolved. Our first story takes us to the mighty Smoky Mountains on the East Tennessee and North Carolina line for the mystery of Trinny Gibson, a field trip that goes terribly wrong, and suddenly the entire nation is asking the question, just where did Trinny go? A 16-year-old girl disappears into thin air while on a school field trip. The FBI investigation unveiled disturbing events that led up to her mysterious disappearance. And the events that happened in the days after only left more baffling questions with no answers, as a search team of 200 people desperately searched Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains. Did this teenage girl get lost? Was she attacked by an animal? Or was it something more sinister? By all accounts, Trinny Gibson was living a good life in the scruffy city of Knoxville, Tennessee. Her father was a traveling salesman for a large chemical company, and he had moved the family there just 8 years earlier as part of his job. It seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. After all, it was one of the most scenic places in America, with the nearby Smoky Mountains National Park, and the area boasted low crime and good churches and schools. It was here that Trinny and her 3 teenage siblings grew up. Her 18-year-old brother had just went off to boot camp for the Navy in Florida, and Trinny was a junior at Bearden High School. Everyone who knew Trinny talked about how much she loved music, especially the rock band Jethro Tull. They also talked about how focused and how disciplined she was. She had spent the previous summer working at Morrison's cafeteria, where she earned nearly $2,000. She put $1,000 in a savings account, and she treated herself to a $600 blue sapphire and diamond ring, and kept the other $200 in her purse. Her father was so impressed by her work ethic that he promised her he'd buy her a car for Christmas if she only kept her grades up. In school, several boys had a crush on her, but Trinny hadn't shown much interest in return. Nonetheless, she was a popular girl with lots of friends and a straight-A student who was dreaming of studying landscape architecture at the University of Tennessee. One of Trinny's favorite classes was her horticulture class, taught by Mr. Dunlap. Now, Mr. Dunlap was a favorite among students for his energetic and spontaneous teaching style. And when he told the students that he was taking them on a surprise field trip the very next day, he assured them that although he wouldn't reveal exactly where he was taking them, that they would have a wonderful time learning about plants and trees. Now, that last statement probably seems a bit odd to most listeners. What? A teacher taking a class on a field trip without telling them where they're going? Well, folks, it was the 1970s, and the rules and the regulations that we take for granted in public schools nowadays just weren't in place back then. When Trinny came home and told her father about the field trip, Mr. Gibson was confident that they were probably going on a hiking trip, perhaps in the Smoky Mountains. And because Mr. Gibson was a former Eagle Scout and troop leader, he discussed safety precautions with Trinny. They discussed how to determine north by looking at moss on a tree, and even which plants or mosses were edible in case of an emergency. But the truth be told, both Trinny and Mr. Gibson were confident that the trip would be canceled because the weather forecast for the next day was calling for dreary conditions. The very next day was Friday, and when Trinny looked out her window, she saw that it was already raining, and she just knew the field trip would be canceled. So she put on her favorite blue jeans, a blue striped sweater, her blue Adidas shoes, and her blue sapphire ring. And as Trinny's mother drove her to school, they were both surprised when they pulled into the parking lot to see a bus parked in front of the school, waiting to take the students on the mystery field trip. And sure enough, by 9 a.m., an announcement was made for Trinny and 37 of her horticultural classmates to begin loading the bus for a field trip bound for Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains. Trinny spent the 90-minute bus ride seated next to a friend of hers, Robert Simpson, who liked to listen to the same type of music as Trinny. The bus was full of teenage laughter and conversation as the students were looking to make the best of the trip, despite the less than ideal weather conditions. By 12 p.m., the group arrived at Clingman's Dome, and the bus parked in a large parking area, where Mr. Dunlap quickly outlined the goals of the trip, which was to make the 2-mile hike each way to the top of Andrews Bald, observing the types of plants and trees at the different elevations, and for each student to be prepared to write a paper over the weekend discussing their findings. Back in class on Monday, everyone was instructed to be back at the bus by 3:30 p.m. The 38 students quickly spread into smaller groups based on their walking speeds as they set out on the trail along Forney Ridge. The weather was in the low 40s and it was drizzling as they traveled down the narrow trail, and Robert could see that Trinny was cold, so he gave her his jacket. By 1:30, the group had reached the summit of Andrews Bald and started back towards the bus. Trinny and Robert had walked together for the entire time up until now, when suddenly he strangely told Trinny that he was going to go back and look for some bears, and he left her walking by herself. Now, you have to keep in mind that the trail they were traveling on was narrow and wet due to the weather, with steep drop-offs on both sides, and the group was traveling in a long single-file line. Trinny was positioned in the middle of the group, and it would have been impossible for her to leave the trail without all her classmates taking notice. Once the group was about 3/4 of a mile from the bus, several of Trinny's friends said that they saw Trinny bend over to take a look at something on the ground on the right side of the trail. And when they looked up again, Trinny wasn't there anymore. Now, they didn't think too much of it at the time, but little did they know, this would be the last time anyone ever saw Trinny again. And what happens next has remained one of the greatest mysteries to ever occur in the Smoky Mountains to this very day.
Today's video is sponsored by the Appalachian Storyteller candles, handcrafted the old-fashioned way, one at a time, in the mountains of East Tennessee. Get yours today by clicking the link below.
Welcome back to Appalachia Unsolved as we investigate what happened to Trinny Gibson. On the morning of Friday, October 8th, 1976, 38 high school students from Knoxville, Tennessee, set out on a hiking trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. Yet, only 37 students returned to the bus that afternoon. Trinny Gibson was missing. Frantically, Mr. Dunlap took a small group of the last kids back to the spot where Trinny was last seen. Then, they backtracked the entire trail, calling her name the entire time. Yet, they couldn't find her. By 4:30 p.m., Mr. Dunlap contacted the park rangers and informed them that Trinny was missing as the school bus headed back to Knoxville without Trinny or her teacher, who stayed behind to help look for her. By 7:30, word had spread by CB radio, and a small group of 19 park rangers and volunteers set out into the wind and the rain and the fog, desperately calling for Trinny, using loudspeakers and whistles. But other than the sound of the falling rain, they were met with silence, and then nightfall. The search would have to resume in the morning as the temperatures fell into the low 30s and heavy wind and rain blew all through the night. By 5 a.m., Trinny's father arrived on the scene with a pair of shoes that Trinny had recently worn to help the dogs track her scent. The road across Newfoundland Gap was closed, and a search team of over 200 men with 6 teams of bloodhounds and German shepherds scoured every inch of the ground, working in half-mile grids all the way out to a 25-mile radius. Every creek, every cliff, every trail, and every bottom was searched. Meanwhile, by air, 2 Army helicopters from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and several National Guard helicopters from North Carolina and Tennessee searched the sky. Yet, fall was in full swing, and a canopy of changing and fallen leaves, combined with the rugged fir and the heavy briar undergrowth, made the search from the air futile. It seemed it would be up to the bloodhounds to find any trace of Trinny. And within hours, they did just that. 3 teams of dogs followed Trinny from where she was last seen, down the trail where it appeared she made a wrong turn, and was now on the Appalachian Trail, where she continued until she circled the concrete base of the Clingman's Dome observation tower. Down the Appalachian Trail she went until the trail suddenly went cold where it neared Highway 441. The search went on for 3 solid weeks in near freezing temperatures, and by now, there was a full-scale FBI investigation as the 25-mile square area was combed over and over and over again. There were no items of clothing, no shoes, nothing. Trinny Gibson had vanished. It was then that the FBI and the park rangers announced publicly that they didn't believe she was ever going to be found in the mountains. In fact, they believed that she might have been abducted. Every camping permit was tracked down, and the FBI investigated every person who was known to have been in the area at the time, including folks from all over America. And that's when Trinny's father told the police that he believed another student might be responsible for her disappearance. It turns out that Trinny had been involved in a disturbing event that had taken place just 2 years earlier, when another student from Bearden High School named Kelvin Bowman was stalking her. He was so obsessed with Trinny that he had even broken into the Gibson home, where Trinny's mother had shot him in the foot. Kelvin was convicted and spent time in juvenile detention, where he made several threats that he would kill Trinny once he got out. The most astonishing part of this was that the Knox County public school system put Kelvin right back in the same school with Trinny when he was released. This definitely seemed worth investigating, yet attendance records indicated that he had been at school all day on the day that Trinny went missing. Just like that, investigators were back at square one, and no one could answer where Trinny Gibson was. She had vanished into thin air. Had she gotten lost and succumbed to the elements? Did she slip and die in a fall, falling into a creek bed? Was she attacked by wild animals? Perhaps she ran into a stranger on the Appalachian Trail and foul play was involved. After all, 2 teenage girls' remains had been found buried in this area during the 1970s. Did she run into a serial killer? Was she picked up on the road and kidnapped? Did the classroom teacher actually call the roll back at school? After all, many times teachers don't. Did Kelvin Bowman follow the school bus to the Smoky Mountains and follow through on his threats? Or did Trinny simply want to disappear and start a new life? And if so, why did she leave all her money at home? She even left her purse in the car with her mother that morning. Over the past 48 years, countless searches have been organized looking for Trinny, including one that was ordered by President Carter in 1981. Yet, no trace of Trinny Gibson has ever been found. Trinny's disappearance continues to baffle investigators to this very day. Why would Robert suddenly leave Trinny on the trail just a few moments before she disappeared? And what about the stalker? Had he followed them and hidden in the woods and waited for the group to return? And finally, what about the teacher who refused to tell the students exactly where they were going on this mysterious field trip? Indeed, these are just a few questions that need answers. What about you? What do you think happened to Trinny? Our next story takes place in the small town of Corbin, Kentucky, where a faithful husband and a loving mother suddenly mysteriously vanish without a trace. Just what exactly happened to Claude and Sue Sheldon? A young couple vanishes without a trace, leaving behind 3 small children sleeping in their beds. The clues that remain only raise more questions with no answers as the police search the rivers, the mountains, and the lakes of eastern Kentucky. Did these loving parents drive away during the night and abandon their children? Or were they involved in a tragic accident? Or was it something more sinister? Corbin was your typical small rural town in eastern Kentucky. With a population of barely more than 7,000 people, it was the type of place where everybody knew everyone. It was here that Claude and Sue Shelton were raising their young family. The upstart family lived in a small trailer park. Sue was a 27-year-old homemaker who spent her days tending to her 3 small children. Claude was a hard-working, blue-collar type fella. He had always loved cars and grown up turning wrenches on them. So it was only natural when he became the head mechanic at the local muffler and tire shop in Corbin. Folks who knew Claude described him as a family man and a perfectionist who was quiet-spoken. Indeed, he was steady and dependable. He had worked at the same shop for the past 10 years, 5 days a week, like clockwork. And whenever he wasn't busy working on customers' cars, he could always be found tinkering or shining on his pride and joy, his 1967 two-door Ford Galaxy 500. By all appearances, by May of 1971, Claude and Sue were living a good, simple life, and things were looking up for them. They only owed one more payment on their trailer, and they were dreaming of buying a bigger home for their growing family. And with only 1 week left in school for the children, the fun days of summer were in the air. In many ways, it was the perfect life. Yet, what happened next was so shocking and mysterious that no one in Corbin, Kentucky would have ever believed it. And more than 50 years later, local folks still wonder exactly what happened to Claude and Sue Shelton. The morning of May 21st, 1971, started just like any other day at the Shelton household. Being Friday, there was a bit more excitement than usual in the air, with the weekend coming up, and the weather outlook was perfect. By 6 a.m., Claude had finished his coffee and his breakfast before making the short drive to the muffler shop for work. Sue spent the morning getting the 3 kids dressed for school and making them breakfast before seeing them off at the bus stop. Back at the muffler shop, it was a slow day, and being the perfect day for a drive, Claude asked for the afternoon off after promising his boss that he would work half a day on Saturday to make up the time. And by the time the children were home from school, Claude and Sam had packed the Ford up and decided to make the scenic drive up to Claude's mother's house, about 20 miles away in Williamsburg. Now, this area of Kentucky is majestic to drive through, with the nearby Cumberland Falls State Park and the Daniel Boone National Forest and the beautiful Laurel River Lake, where a new dam was being constructed. The young family enjoyed the cruise in the father's prized automobile, with the perfect 70-degree weather and the windows rolled down. Upon arriving at Claude's mother's house, they spent the entire afternoon and evening there, eating supper and enjoying catching up with one another. In fact, time seemed to pass so fast that Claude didn't realize that it was suddenly past midnight, and he had to be at work at 6 a.m. the next morning down at the shop. With that in mind, Claude and Sue loaded up the kids and drove home, arriving between 1 and 2 a.m. and immediately putting the kids to bed. Now, what happens next still baffles investigators to this very day. Here are the facts concerning the next events of the early hours. According to the oldest child, who was 11 at the time, her younger siblings were fast asleep once they were put to bed. Yet, she was still awake and could easily hear her parents talking in the living room through the paper-thin trailer walls. And they were talking about going to get a late-night snack and coffee from the truck stop that was 5 miles down the road. "Come on, it's time to go. If you're going with me, let's go," she heard her pa say. And just like that, the couple left their 3 children in the bed as they drove off into the night at 2:30 a.m. Welcome back to Appalachia Unsolved as we investigate what happened to Claude and Sue Shelton. By the next morning, the children woke up and saw that their parents weren't in the bed, and their car wasn't in the driveway. After eating breakfast on their own, the children called one of Sue's friends to see if they knew where their parents were. But they too had no clue. And by 7 a.m., Claude's boss knocked on the door, wanting to know where he was and why he didn't show up to work. No, none of this made any sense. By all accounts, Claude and Sue Shelton loved their children, and Claude had been steadily employed for 10 years, and they had a good family life. There on the kitchen counter was a savings jar containing $600 cash, and beside that was Sue's purse, which was left behind. And today was payday at work, and Claude didn't even pick up his paycheck. Police were immediately contacted, and an investigation was launched right away. Detectives began interviewing the employees of the local gas station, which was the only business in town that was open at the time of the disappearance, and it was thought to have been their destination. Yet, the employees stated that they had never seen them. In fact, no one had been at the gas station at all between the hours of 1 and 3:30 a.m. in the sleepy little town. This concerned officials. It was unthinkable that well-respected parents would simply abandon their children. Perhaps an accident had taken place. So over the next 3 days, the Kentucky State Police scoured the entire state, interviewing everyone in Whitley County. News stations ran the story repeatedly, yet there were no leads. And soon the Civil Air Patrol and 4 rescue squads from nearby towns were searching the woods and the lakes for nearly a week. But there were no clues. Claude and Sue Shelton had vanished without a trace. The Shelton children spent the final week of school staying at a family friend's house. Yet, once school was out, investigators still didn't have a clue what had happened. So at that point, the children went to stay with Sue's mother in Knoxville, Tennessee, for what everyone thought was a short visit. However, more than 50 years later, Claude and Sue Shelton never reappeared. What happened to them? Why did they leave their children and all their money at home at 2:30 in the morning? It seems unthinkable that they would have simply abandoned their 3 young children. Everybody who knew them said they always had their children with them, and they were good parents. Now, during the time of the Sheltons' disappearance, nearby Laurel Lake Dam was under construction, and over the years, police and diver teams have searched several areas of the lake looking for Claude's 1967 Ford Galaxy 500. Yet, Laurel River Lake is massive, with over 206 miles of shoreline, and is nearly 280 feet deep. Perhaps the only possible clue that was ever found in this case was provided by an 18-wheeler driver who passed through Corbin at 1 a.m. on the night of the disappearance. He seemed to remember that a car was on the side of the road with its hood up. Is it possible that Claude saw the stranded vehicle on the side of the road and offered assistance due to his mechanical skills? And is it possible that the couple fell prey to foul play because of this? In 2009, a glimmer of hope came when the Shelton children entered their DNA into the Unsolved Crimes database. It was thought that it might lead to a positive identification in other unsolved cases, and perhaps to bring closure to this mystery. Yet, no matches were found anywhere in the United States. More than 50 years later, Claude and Sue Shelton and their 1967 Ford have never been seen again. This case remains open and unsolved with the Kentucky State Police. Why did Claude and Sue leave their children at home and leave in the middle of the night? And why did they leave all their money at home? And what about that truck driver, what he saw on the side of the road? Is it possible that Claude stopped to offer help only to meet with foul play? And what about that large lake? Does the secret of Claude and Sue Shelton lay underneath its deep waters? What about you? What do you think happened? Our next story is a parent's worst nightmare. A 6-year-old boy disappears while playing in his own front yard. Just what happened to Kelly Holland? A 6-year-old boy disappears in his front yard, and the events that happened in the hours after only left more baffling questions with no answers as police searched desperately in the remote mountains of Kentucky. Was this little boy kidnapped? Did he get lost in the woods? Or was it something more sinister? To better understand the circumstances of Kelly's case, it's best to start with some background. Kelly's mother was named Judy Moore, a young Kentucky girl who had dropped out of school by the time she was 14 and quickly married a man named Bobby Holland. Within a couple years, Judy had given birth to a son and a daughter. Yet, times were hard due to the fact that neither Judy nor Bobby had a job. It was only a matter of time before the Department of Children's Services stepped in and declared both of them unfit parents, and a judge issued a court order granting custody of both their children to Judy's parents, who lived an hour away in Jackson. However, within a few months, on November 17, 1975, Kelly was born and was the only child living at home with Judy and Bobby. For some reason, his birth went unnoticed by the state of Kentucky, and it didn't result in any action from Child Protective Services. Yet, even with a new baby, it wasn't enough to keep the parents together. They quickly divorced, and Bobby moved off to Florida. And as you might imagine, Kelly was born into a world that was far from a fairy tale. After losing custody of her two oldest children and her husband, Kelly became his mother's reason for living. And, according to her, he was the only thing that she had left. That is, until 1981, when both Judy and Kelly moved into a rental house with her new boyfriend, Kurt Campbell, who lived in Pine Tree Holler, which was located in Knott County, Kentucky. This place was your typical holler, with only about 50 souls calling this place home. It was the type of place where everyone knew everybody, and many of them were family. They knew your car, anytime you left home, what time you came back, and those watchful eyes didn't miss anything. By 1982, Kelly was 6 years old, and it was here that he would grow up. The young boy had been born with a cleft palate and severe asthma, and he had recently been in the hospital several times that left him with a scar on the left side of his mouth. But besides that, Kelly was a typical child of the mountains. He loved to play outside with his friends and down at the creek, or exploring the endless forest that surrounded his home. And he had also just enrolled in Jones Fork Elementary School as a kindergartner. And in many ways, school was an escape for the young boy, because his home life was still full of poverty and lacking many luxuries like cable television or a phone. The disappearance of Kelly took place on Friday, February 12th, 1982. Now, keep in mind that the only person at home when Kelly mysteriously vanished was his mother, and all of the details that follow are what she later told police. The night before, a heavy winter storm blew through, and by Friday morning, Pine Tree Holler was a blanket of thick snow and sub-freezing temperatures. So much so that it was impossible for school buses to pick up children on the twisting mountain roads, and school was canceled for the day. This was a young boy's dream, no school, making it a 3-day weekend to build snowmans and have snowball fights in the fresh snow. Kelly slept in late that morning before getting up and asking his mother if he could go outside and play. According to Judy, she originally told the boy he couldn't because of his asthma, but eventually she gave in about 11 o'clock a.m. and let him play in the front yard. And with that, Kelly slipped on his snow boots and put on his blue coat and set out to the yard. For the next 5 hours, Kelly played outside with a young mother glancing out of the window at him from time to time to make sure he was okay. According to Judy, lunch came and went, but Kelly never came in to eat. By 4 p.m., Kelly was still playing in the freezing temperatures with nothing on but a pair of jeans and a light jacket. At this time, Judy needed to make a phone call to her sister, which meant she would need to walk to a neighbor's house to use their phone. She told Kelly she would be right back, and then she set out to the neighbor's. Yet, when she returned an hour later, Kelly wasn't in the yard anymore, or in the house. But Judy just figured he was at a friend's house to watch the Dukes of Hazzard. She thought nothing of it, and strangely, at 6 p.m., she made herself supper and ate alone without her 6-year-old son. She said she just thought he was still playing, which seems a bit odd considering the young boy hadn't ate since breakfast. By 7 p.m., Judy decided to walk over to her neighbor's house and make Kelly come home. Yet, it turned out that none of the neighbors had seen him at all that whole day. Panic immediately set in, and Judy decided to call the police, so she walked over to her boyfriend's grandparents' house to use their phone. Once the frightened young mother told the grandparents that Kelly was missing, astonishingly, Judy said that they told her she couldn't use her phone to dial 911 until after midnight because the call would be cheaper. Now that statement boggles most logical thinkers' minds. Her child was missing. Why not just force her way and make that call? Or how about going back to the other neighbor's house where she had borrowed the phone earlier in the afternoon? Most parents would have at least done that. Yet, Judy decided to wait until midnight to call the authorities. But by now, word had gotten out amongst the locals, and most neighbors were busy looking for Kelly. Yet, strangely, none of them called the police either. It was dark, and footsteps in the snow were already being covered up and disappearing due to another snowstorm. Finally, the fateful call to police came at 12 a.m., 8 hours after Kelly had last been seen by his mother. Then Judy called her own parents to let them know. Curiously, her parents were reported to have told Judy on the phone, I told you we should have taken him too." It was now 2 a.m. before the deputy sheriffs arrived on the scene, and after searching the immediate area, they quickly realized that they needed more help to search the vast surrounding mountains. By 3 a.m., the State Highway Patrol arrived on the scene, but the intense snow and total darkness made the search futile. So the decision was made to resume the search in the morning. Everyone on the scene knew Kelly's life hung in the balance, but the questions remained. What happened to him, and where did he go? Welcome back to Appalachia Unsolved as we continue the investigation of Kelly Holland. Before long, questions and rumors began swirling. Had Kelly gotten lost in the woods and froze to death? Had someone abducted him? That didn't seem likely, given the remote location and the number of eyes that would have surely recognized an unfamiliar car on the dead-end road. Had something more sinister happened? After all, police investigators had discovered that there were several residents living in the holler that had criminal records. And, most disturbing, why had Judy waited 11 hours after Kelly was last seen to call the police? Now, I gotta tell you, as a parent, that makes no sense to me. Maybe you have a theory about why she did it. Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, after 16 days, the search for Kelly was called off. Yet, the investigation continued. One by one, every person who lived in the area was carefully examined and then ruled out. It had become obvious that only one person had any information about the timeline of that day, and that was Kelly's mother. And police needed more answers from Judy Moore, so they interviewed her several more times. And inconsistencies in her story began to raise suspicions. All of a sudden, she made claims that she had seen a strange green car in the area that day, and that possibly Kelly's father, who lived in Florida, had abducted him. But that too turned out to be a dead end for authorities. By March 3rd, despite the lack of any physical evidence, a grand jury subpoenaed Judy Moore to testify in court as to her son's disappearance. But in the end, no charges were filed against her. Kelly Jr. Holland's disappearance became a cold case file. As the months slowly turned into years, psychics were called in, and Judy was given a lie detector test, which she passed. Anonymous tips came in about a shallow grave that was discovered. Another time, a tip came in about a grave that was buried underneath a concrete porch that had been poured around the time of Kelly's disappearance. Police exhausted every tip and every lead, and they nearly dug up that entire holler. But in the end, no trace of Kelly was found. It's been 42 years since Kelly vanished without a trace. It was long rumored by locals that Judy's sister once made a statement that both of them had killed Kelly and buried his body. Yet, Judy and her sister both denied that fact, even though they no longer had contact with one another. And in 2010, Judy's sister died, and it was rumored that she had wrote one last letter that was only to be opened after her death. Yet, no one knows what happened to that letter, because if it exists, it has never surfaced. Kelly's mother, Judy, has never been charged and still maintains her innocence to this very day.
Why would a mother leave her 6-year-old child playing in the snow without a jacket all day? And why in the world would she let him go without lunch? Why did the neighbors refuse to call 911? These are just a few questions surrounding the disappearance of Kelly. Police have released this sketch of what Kelly would look like today. Is it possible that he's out there somewhere today? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Gladys Kidd was your typical grandmother. Well, at least that's what everyone thought. Yet, things aren't always what they always seem to be. Buckle up for the mysterious story of Gladys Kidd.
A 71-year-old grandmother vanishes into thin air. A secret relationship, a mysterious letter, and the missing $80,000 cash. And the events that led up in the days and the weeks after only left more baffling questions with no answers. As detectives searched desperately in the mountains of Kentucky. Was Gladys Kidd kidnapped? Did she disappear and start a new life? Or was it something more sinister? Moorhead, Kentucky was your typical small town in eastern Kentucky. A beautiful, fertile valley nestled along Triplet Creek and was surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains. Less than 8,000 people lived in this picturesque community, giving it a neighborly charm where everybody knew everybody. It was here that Gladys Kidd had lived for the past 50 years. Her husband, Claude, had purchased a 100-acre farm in 1944 and built Gladys a cozy ranch house perched high atop Creek's Ridge. The couple raised their family in this little slice of heaven as Claude worked the farm and Gladys worked as a cook down at Moorhead State University. However, in 1983, Claude suddenly passed away, leaving the beautiful farm to his wife. At first, Gladys had a hard time adjusting to life as a widow on her own. Her children were now grown, but lucky for Gladys, there was a passel of young grandchildren to help occupy her time. So it was, and she slowly began to rebuild her life. She became active in her small church, and she developed a green thumb and loved working in her garden. And that farm quickly became the center of family life as she cooked large meals for every holiday and birthday. But most of all, there was nothing she enjoyed more than spoiling those grandkids. Oh, she loved them to no end. They were her entire world, and she would do anything for them. So you see, to friends and family and neighbors, Gladys Kidd seemed like one of the last people on earth who would pack up and leave. Besides her strong family ties, she was a popular figure in the neighborhood and always had a friendly word to say. According to her neighbors, everyone who knew her said she had a big heart.
Everybody likes Gladys,
said Dora Stone, a neighbor and a friend.
I was her neighbor for 40 years, and we talked about everything. There were no secrets between us. I wouldn't have ever thought that she would have just disappeared out of the thin air. Everyone around here knew her. She just wasn't a mean person, and she would do anything for anybody. And I can't see her putting her family through all this pain and sorrow.
And the relatives were equally puzzled. Yet, in the months leading up to her disappearance, unbeknownst to everyone, Gladys was secretly living a double life. And it would turn out that she kept more than one secret from those even closest to her. And what happens in the dark will soon come to the light, my friend. And those secrets were about to be revealed for all the world to see. And I'll tell you right now, no one was prepared for what happens next. "71-year-old Gladys Kidd had lived on her 100-acre farm for nearly 50 years, including the last 7 as a widow. Yet, in August of 1990, she hinted to her son that it was beginning to be too much for her to take care of that farm on her own. Perhaps she should think about selling it and downsizing. Maybe she could get a small house near the grandchildren so she could see them more often. With that in mind, Gladys's oldest son contacted a realtor and made arrangements to spend a weekend with his mother, touring houses. However, no matter how many houses they looked at, Gladys just didn't seem to show much interest, and it didn't make much sense to her son. To him, it seemed like she was just going through the motions. And then there were those mysterious phone calls. You see, in those last few months, it seemed the phone kept ringing. Yet, if anyone besides Gladys answered the phone, the caller would immediately hang up and call right back. In those moments, Gladys would nearly run to answer the phone before anyone else could. And after each phone call, she would drop everything she was doing and get in her car and leave without telling anyone where she was going. Her family didn't know what to make of it. Who was this caller on the phone that Gladys would only whisper to? And where did she go after each phone call, disappearing for hours on end? Had she met another man? Possibly, but even if that were true, she had previously dated a few other men for companionship during the years since her husband had died. Yet she had always been open and candid about those relationships. But that wasn't the case with this mystery caller. She flat out refused to reveal his identity or talk about where she went after each phone call. The only clue she ever revealed was that her family would be surprised if they really knew who it was. Now, this behavior began to cause several arguments with her children, who were only trying to look out for their mother. Who was she involved with that she couldn't reveal his identity? Was he a community leader trying to keep their relationship secret? For that matter, was it a boyfriend at all? One thing was for sure, none of this sudden behavior seemed anything like it was Gladys's own free will. Gladys spent all of Sunday, April 5th, 1990, at her local church, baking cakes and cookies and volunteering for a community fundraiser. However, the following day, on Monday, August 6th, she got up bright and early and drove her 1979 Malibu Classic to the First People's Bank in Moorhead, Kentucky, where she withdrew $80,000 from her account and requested the entire amount in cash. This took the bank tellers by complete surprise, and even the manager asked her if she'd take a cashier's check instead, since it was dangerous to carry that much cash. Yet, with a stone face and no details, Gladys insisted on cash, and once they finished counting out the $100 bills to her, she walked out of that bank and simply disappeared. I mean, she was never seen again. And that afternoon, when she never came home, the police were called, and they found Gladys's car still in the bank parking lot with the keys in the ignition. And the family? Well, they couldn't believe that she'd withdrawn $80,000 from the bank. That didn't make any sense, since Gladys lived on a fixed income of $700 a month from her Social Security check, and she didn't have any savings. And that's when it was discovered that Gladys had sold the entire family farm that very day and disappeared, leaving behind her children, grandchildren, lifelong friends, and all her earthly possessions. Investigators quickly issued a missing persons report all over the state of Kentucky. They interviewed everyone who knew anything about Gladys, looking for any clues. But no one knew anything about her selling her farm that she had lived on for more than 50 years. In fact, it had never even been publicly listed on the market. And more importantly, no one knew anything about the mysterious phone calls that she had been getting besides her family. Days went by, and then a week, but no tips came in, when finally, a couple weeks later, A puzzling series of mysterious letters began to appear, and all were postmarked from different states. The first one was to her grandson, telling him that he could have the Malibu. And then there were the 3 letters to her 3 adult kids. Each letter was written in Gladys's handwriting, insisting that no one should ever try to find her, because even if they did find her, she would never come back home. But something wasn't right about those letters. You see, Gladys only had a 4th grade education and was a horribly bad speller and writer. Yet, oddly, each letter that was sent to her children contained flawless grammar and penmanship and used language that Gladys had never used, let alone write. In fact, it wasn't the way she talked at all. It was almost like someone had coached or even forced her exactly what to write and say. Even stranger, Gladys had only been out of the state of Kentucky a handful of times her entire life. Indeed, Gladys had always been completely open about her finances and her life with her children, and up until this moment, she had depended on them for everything. Yet suddenly, she had secretly sold the family farm and withdrew every penny of her money from the bank and vanished. And as the months rolled by, the letters stopped, and they never heard from her again. The woman who had religiously sent birthday and Christmas cards was now silent and even more curious. When Gladys' driver's license expired, she never renewed it again. And although she had grown up during the Great Depression and was very tight with her money, she never attempted to collect her $700 Social Security payment again. Over the next couple decades, police searched every database in America, but Gladys Kidd never opened any type of account again. All of a sudden, she simply no longer existed. What happened to Gladys Kidd? Did she run off and start a new life with a man from the community? And if so, it doesn't seem likely, since she was the only one to disappear. Was she stalked and kidnapped in the bank parking lot? Had someone manipulated her into selling her farm and then taking her money? Or did she meet with foul play?
It certainly seems unlikely that Gladys would have simply disappeared on her own free will. But, as we have seen, stranger things have happened in these mountains. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia.